Amina's day usually began before the sun had fully risen. The streets were still quiet, and a cool breeze moved through the narrow lanes of her small town. She would walk quickly, her footsteps soft but steady, as if she had already memorized every crack in the road. By the time she reached the café, the sky would be turning pale, and the world would slowly begin to wake up. The café was not anything special. It sat on a corner where people passed by without giving it much thought. The paint on the walls had faded over the years, and the wooden door made a soft creaking sound every time it opened. Inside, there were a few small tables, each with chairs that had been used for so long they no longer matched. A faint smell of coffee and baked bread always lingered in the air, mixed with the scent of old wood. Amina liked it that way. She tied her apron the same way every morning, making sure the knot was firm. Then she would begin her routine, wiping tables, arranging cups, and checking that everything was in place before the first customers arrived. She worked quietly, rarely speaking unless someone spoke to her first. To most people, she was just another worker doing her job, someone easy to overlook. But Amina didn't mind being unnoticed. In fact, she preferred it. There was a corner of the café that almost no one paid attention to. It held an old piano, covered in a thin layer of dust. The wood was scratched, and a few of the keys had lost their shine. It looked like something from another time, something that no longer belonged in the present. Most customers assumed it didn't even work. Amina always noticed it. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would walk past it slowly. Her fingers would brush lightly against the edge, as if greeting an old friend she could not speak to. But she never sat down to play. Not anymore. The cafe owner, a middle-aged man named Rashid, didn't care much about the piano. To him, it was just decoration, something left behind by the previous owner. He had once thought about removing it, but never found the time. It simply stayed there, silent and forgotten. "Make sure the front tables are ready," Rashid would often say in the mornings, his voice firm but not unkind. Amina would nod. Yes. That was usually the extent of their conversation. As the day went on, the cafe would fill with people. Some came for tea, others for a quick meal. There were regulars who sat in the same seats every day, talking about the same things: work, money, family, and sometimes the weather. Their voices blended together into a constant background noise. Amina moved between the tables with quiet efficiency. She carried trays, took orders, and cleared dishes without drawing attention to herself. Her movements were smooth, almost practiced to perfection. If someone watched closely, they might notice the care she put into even the smallest task, but most people didn't watch that closely. Every now and then, someone would glance at the piano and ask, "Does anyone play that?" Rashid would usually laugh it off. "It's just for show." And that would be the end of it. But Amina always heard those questions. She would keep her eyes down and continue working, pretending she hadn't noticed. Yet inside something would stir, something she tried very hard to keep quiet. There was a time when music had been a big part of her life. Years ago, she had spent countless hours sitting in front of a piano, learning, practicing, and improving. Back then, her fingers had moved with confidence, and every note had felt natural to her. She had once believed that music would be her future. But life had a way of changing things. Circumstances had forced her to leave that world behind. It wasn't one single moment, but a series of events that slowly pushed her away from it. Responsibilities grew heavier, and opportunities faded. Over time, the piano became something distant, a memory rather than a reality. Amina rarely spoke about that part of her life. In fact, most people who knew her now had no idea it had ever existed. To them, she was simply a quiet worker in a small cafe, and she let them believe that. One afternoon, when the cafe was less crowded than usual, Amina found herself alone near the corner. The piano stood there, just as it always did, silent and still. For a moment, she paused. She looked around. No one seemed to be paying attention. Slowly, she stepped closer. Her hand reached out, hovering above the keys for a second before gently pressing one. The sound was soft, slightly out of tune, but but still clear enough to fill the quiet space. She quickly pulled her hand back, as if she had done something she wasn't supposed to do. Her heart beat a little faster. It had been so long since she had touched a piano like that. Even that single note brought back a rush of memories. Late evenings, long practice sessions, the feeling of losing track of time while playing. Amina! She turned quickly at the sound of her name. Rashid was standing a few steps away, watching her. Yes? She said, trying to keep her voice steady. Customers are coming in. Stay focused. Of course. She stepped away from the piano immediately and returned to her work. The moment passed, but the feeling stayed with her. That evening, as the cafe grew busy again, Amina worked as she always did. She smiled when needed, spoke politely, and kept everything running smoothly. No one could tell that anything had changed. But inside, something had shifted. She found herself glancing at the piano more often than usual. It was still just an object in the corner, still ignored by everyone else. Yet to her, it felt different now, as if it was quietly calling out to her. She shook the thought away. There was no point in thinking about it. That part of her life was over. Or at least that's what she told herself. As the night came to an end and the last customers left, the cafe returned to its usual quiet state. Amina cleaned the tables, stacked the chairs, and prepared everything for the next day. It was the same routine she followed every night. Before leaving, she paused near the door and looked back. The piano stood in the corner, just as it always had. Still silent, still waiting. For a brief moment, she wondered what it would feel like to sit down and play again. Not just a single note, but a full piece. To let her fingers move freely, to hear the music fill the room. But the thought faded as quickly as it came. Amina turned off the lights and stepped outside into the cool night air. The streets were quieter now, much like they had been in the morning. She began her walk home, her footsteps echoing softly around her. To anyone watching, she looked the same as always. A simple young woman returning home after a long day of work. No one could see the story she carried within her. No one could hear the music she had buried deep inside. And for now, that was exactly how she wanted it to be. The next day began like any other, but there was a strange feeling in the air that Amina could not explain. It wasn't something she could see or hear. It was just a quiet sense that something was about to change, even though everything around her looked the same. She reached the cafe early, just as she always did. The streets were calm, and the sky was still soft with morning light. When she pushed open the door, the familiar creak greeted her again. Inside, the cafe felt still, as if it had been waiting for her. She tied her apron, picked up a cloth and started wiping the tables. Her movements were steady, but her mind was not as calm as usual. Every now and then, her eyes moved toward the corner where the piano stood. It hadn't changed. It was still quiet, still covered in dust. But after what happened the day before, it no longer felt invisible to her. Amina, don't forget to check the back shelves. Rashid's voice came from behind the counter. Yes, she replied, quickly turning away. She didn't want to be caught looking at the piano again. The morning passed slowly. A few regular customers came in, took their usual seats, and ordered the same drinks. Amina moved between tables, placing cups, taking orders, and keeping everything in order. Her face remained calm, but her thoughts kept drifting. At one point, an older man sitting near the window glanced toward the piano. That thing still works? He asked casually. Rashid shrugged. I doubt it. No one here plays. Amina heard every word, even though she was across the room. Her hands paused for just a second before she continued working. The man chuckled. Shame. A place like this could use some music. Amina didn't look up. She didn't say anything, but something about those words stayed with her. As the afternoon approached, the cafe became quieter. The rush of customers slowed down, leaving only a few people scattered around. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Amina was arranging cups behind the counter when the door opened again. This time it wasn't a regular. The man who walked in carried himself differently. His clothes were neat, his steps confident, and his eyes sharp, as if he noticed everything around him. He paused for a moment near the entrance, looking around the cafe in silence before choosing a table near the center. Rashid straightened his posture slightly and walked over with a polite smile. "Welcome," he said. "What would you like?" The man spoke calmly. "Just tea for now." His voice was steady, but there was something about it that made people listen. Amina brought the tea to his table a few minutes later. As she placed the cup down, she noticed that he wasn't looking at her. His attention was fixed on something else. She followed his gaze. The piano. Of course. Almost everyone noticed it eventually, but this time felt different. "Does anyone play?" the man asked, without looking away from the piano. Amina hesitated. She wasn't sure if the question was directed at her or just spoken out loud. Before she could respond, Rashid stepped in. "No, it's just there for decoration," he said quickly. "It hasn't been used in years." The man leaned back slightly in his chair, still watching the piano. "That's unfortunate," he said. "A silent piano feels like a wasted voice." Amina felt those words more than she expected. Rashid gave a small laugh. "People come here to eat and talk. Music is not really needed." The man didn't respond to that. Instead, he took a sip of his tea and remained quiet. For a while, everything returned to normal. Amina continued her work, and the cafe carried on with its usual rhythm. But the presence of that man changed the atmosphere. It was subtle but noticeable. He wasn't loud or demanding. In fact, he barely spoke at all. Yet his silence seemed to draw attention. After some time, he placed his cup down and looked toward Rashid again. "May I ask something?" he said. "Of course," Rashid replied. "If someone here could play, would you allow it?" Rashid blinked, slightly surprised. "I suppose, if they knew how." The man nodded slowly, then turned his gaze toward Amina. She felt it immediately. Her hands tightened around the tray she was holding. "You?" he said calmly. "Do you play?" The question landed heavily in the quiet room. Amina's heart began to beat faster. For a moment she considered denying it completely. That would have been the easiest way out. No attention, no expectations. But something stopped her. "I only a little," she said softly. Rashid looked at her in surprise. "You never told me that." Amina avoided his eyes. "It's nothing serious." The man leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Then play something simple," he said. The words sounded easy, almost casual. But to Amina they felt anything but simple. "I don't think that's a good idea," she replied quickly. "I'm out of practice." "It doesn't have to be perfect," the man said. "Just a simple tune." The cafe had grown quieter again. A few customers nearby had started to listen. Their conversations faded as curiosity took over. Rashid crossed his arms, unsure. "If you're not comfortable, you don't have to." Amina stood still. Part of her wanted to walk away, to return to her work and pretend the moment never happened. But another part of her, the part she had been trying to ignore, felt something different. A quiet pull. A memory. A chance. She looked toward the piano. It seemed closer now, even though it hadn't moved. I can try," she said finally. Rashid raised an eyebrow but didn't stop her. "All right, just don't keep the customers waiting too long." Amina nodded. Each step toward the piano felt heavier than the last. The room was silent except for the soft sound of her footsteps. She could feel eyes on her, but she didn't look at anyone. When she reached the piano, she paused. Up close, it looked even older than she remembered. The dust was more visible, the keys slightly worn. It wasn't the kind of instrument she had trained on before, but it was still a piano. She gently pulled the bench closer and sat down. For a moment, she didn't move. Her hands rested in her lap, and her eyes stayed fixed on the keys. Memories began to rise again. Lessons, mistakes, improvements, long hours of practice. The feeling of getting something right after many tries. Her fingers slowly lifted and hovered above the keys. She took a quiet breath. "This is just a simple tune," she reminded herself. "Nothing more." Her first note was soft. It echoed gently through the cafe, catching everyone's attention. A second note followed, then a third. The melody was basic, just as she had promised. Behind her, the room remained still. No one spoke. No one moved. Amina focused only on the keys in front of her. She tried to block everything else out. The people, the pressure, the fear. Just the music. At first, her hands felt stiff. The notes came slowly, carefully placed. It wasn't perfect, but it was steady. And it was real. The man who had asked her to play watched quietly from his seat. His expression didn't change, but his attention was clear. Amina kept playing. Each note helped her relax just a little more. Each sound reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. And though she told herself it was just a simple tune, something deep inside her began to wake up. Amina's fingers rested lightly on the keys for a brief moment after the last soft note faded. The sound lingered in the air, gentle and calm, like a quiet breath. She had done what was asked. A simple tune. Nothing more. Or at least that was what she had planned. She could feel the silence behind her. It wasn't the usual silence of the café. This one felt different, full, waiting. It made her aware of every small movement she made, every sound the piano created. Her hands were no longer trembling as much. That surprised her. For the first few seconds, she had expected her fear to take over completely. She thought her fingers would freeze or press the wrong keys. But that didn't happen. Instead, something else had slowly taken its place. Familiarity. It had been buried for a long time, but it was still there. She let her fingers press another key. Then another. The melody continued, still simple, still soft. But now there was a slight change. Her hands began to move a little more freely, no longer as careful as before. The notes started to connect more smoothly. Behind her, a chair shifted slightly as someone leaned forward. Amina noticed, but she didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the piano. The old instrument responded in its own imperfect way. Some keys sounded slightly dull, others a bit sharper than they should have been. But Amina adjusted without thinking. Her fingers remembered how to adapt, how to make the best of what was in front of her. It had always been like that. Music wasn't about perfection. It was about feeling. And slowly that feeling began to return. The simple tune she started with began to stretch. A few extra notes slipped in between the original ones. Then a small variation. Nothing too obvious at first, but enough to change the flow. Amina didn't plan it. It just happened. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed. She wasn't in the cafe anymore, not fully. Part of her had stepped into a quieter space, one she hadn't visited in a long time. A space where there were no customers, no trays, no voices calling her name. Only the piano. Only the music. Another small change in the melody. This time it was clearer. The tune began to grow, becoming slightly more complex. Her left hand joined in more confidently, adding depth under the main notes. The rhythm shifted, becoming more natural, less forced. A soft murmur moved through the room, but it didn't break her focus. The man who had asked her to play sat still, his eyes fixed on her hands. He had expected something simple, something brief. But this was becoming something else. Rashid stood behind the counter, his arms no longer crossed. His expression had changed. The surprise on his face was clear, even from a distance. Amina didn't see any of it. She was too focused on what she was doing. Another note, then another. Her fingers moved faster now, but not rushed. Each movement felt right, as if her hands already knew where to go before she thought about it. The hesitation from earlier had almost disappeared. In its place was something steady, something strong. A memory surfaced in her mind, sitting at a better piano years ago, practicing the same piece over and over until she got it right. She remembered the frustration, the effort, and finally the moment when everything came together. That same feeling was beginning to rise again. She didn't stop it. The tune she started with was no longer just a simple melody. It had grown into something richer, something layered. It still held its original shape, but now it carried more emotion, more meaning. Her right hand danced across the higher notes while her left hand supported it with deeper tones. The sound filled the cafe in a way it never had before. The old piano, once silent and forgotten, now had a voice again, and it was strong. Amina's posture changed slightly as she leaned in, completely absorbed. Her fingers moved with confidence now, no longer searching, no longer unsure. She wasn't playing for anyone. She wasn't trying to impress. She was simply playing. And that made all the difference. A man sitting near the window slowly set his cup down, his attention fully captured. Another customer who had been about to leave stopped near the door, choosing to stay. No one spoke. No one wanted to break the moment. Even the small sounds of the café, the clinking of cups, the soft footsteps, seemed to fade away. All that remained was the music. Amina added another variation, this time more noticeable. The melody rose higher, then softened again, like a quiet conversation. Carried a sense of emotion that didn't need words. Told a story of something lost, something remembered, something returning. Her heart was no longer racing. Instead, it felt calm, centered, alive. She hadn't felt this way in years. And yet, it felt natural, as if no time had passed at all. The man at the table leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. There was a quiet understanding in his eyes now. He had seen something unexpected, something real. Rashid slowly stepped out from behind the counter, moving a little closer. He didn't want to interrupt, but he couldn't stay where he was either. What he was hearing didn't match what he thought he knew. Amina, the quiet worker who barely spoke, was now filling the entire cafe with music that no one had imagined. And she wasn't even halfway done. Her fingers moved into a slightly faster section. The notes flowed smoothly, connecting in a way that felt effortless. It wasn't rushed or showy. It was controlled, balanced, beautiful. For a moment, she closed her eyes. Not fully, just enough to let herself feel the music without distraction. That was when everything came together. The sound, the movement, the memory, it all aligned. And in that moment, Amina wasn't someone who had left music behind. She was someone who had found it again. The final part of the tune approached, but she didn't rush toward it. She let it build naturally, letting each note carry its weight. The melody softened again, returning to something closer to where it had begun. But it wasn't the same. Couldn't be. Too much had changed. The last few notes were played gently, with care. They echoed through the cafe, slower now, as if they didn't want to end. Then, finally, the sound faded. Amina's hands came to rest. The room stayed silent for a second longer than expected. Not because people didn't know what to do, but because they needed that moment, that pause, to take in what they had just heard. Amina slowly opened her eyes. She looked down at the keys for a moment, as if making sure it was real. Then she became aware of the room again, the people, the silence, and she knew something had changed. Not just for them, but for her too. For a moment no one moved. The last note had faded, but its feeling stayed in the air, as if the sound was still there even though it could no longer be heard. Amina kept her hands resting on the piano keys, unsure of what to do next. Her breathing was calm, but her thoughts were not. She slowly became aware of the silence around her. It wasn't empty. It was full. Then a single clap broke through. It came from somewhere near the center of the cafe. Soft at first, almost unsure. Then another followed. And another. Within seconds, the entire room filled with applause. The sound surprised her. Amina quickly pulled her hands back from the keys and turned slightly on the bench. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in the faces she had seen every day but never really looked at closely. Now they were all looking at her. Not past her. Not through her. Her. She felt a warmth rise in her chest, mixed with a kind of nervous energy she didn't know how to handle. This was not something she was used to. Rashid was among the people clapping, though his expression held more than just appreciation. There was disbelief there too, as if he was still trying to understand what had just happened. The man who had asked her to play did not clap right away. He remained seated, watching her with quiet focus. Then, after a few seconds, he brought his hands together once, slowly. It was not loud, but it carried weight. Amina stood up from the bench, unsure where to look. Her first instinct was to step away from the piano, to return to the safety of her usual routine. But her legs didn't move right away. "You said you only knew a simple tune," the man said calmly. His voice was not loud, yet it reached her clearly through the fading applause. Amina lowered her eyes slightly. "I did. That was more than simple," he replied. She didn't answer. She didn't know how to. Rashid stepped forward, shaking his head lightly as if still in disbelief. "Amina, you never told me you could play like that." A few customers nearby nodded in agreement. "Yes, that was beautiful. Why hide something like that?" Their words came one after another, not overwhelming, but enough to make her feel exposed in a way she hadn't expected. Amina gently stepped away from the piano. "It's nothing," she said quietly. "I haven't played in a long time." "That didn't look like someone who forgot," one of the older customers said with a small smile. Amina gave a polite nod, but she didn't continue the conversation. Instead, she turned and walked back toward the counter, her movements a bit quicker than before. She needed something familiar, something steady. She picked up a tray, even though there was nothing on it. It gave her hands something to do, something to hold on to. But the room had changed. Even as the customers slowly returned to their conversations, their voices were softer now. Their eyes still followed her from time to time. The usual rhythm of the café felt different, as if something important had shifted. Rashid watched her for a moment, then walked back behind the counter. He didn't say anything right away, but his expression remained thoughtful. The man at the table finally stood up. He adjusted his coat slightly and walked toward the counter where Amina was standing. She noticed him approaching and straightened her posture without thinking. "You play with honesty," he said. Amina looked at him, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she said after a short pause. "It's not something that can be taught easily," he continued. "Skill can be learned, but what you showed, that comes from experience." Amina's grip tightened slightly on the tray. "I used to practice a lot," she said, her voice calm but soft. "And then you stopped," he said, more like a statement than a question. She nodded. "Yes." He studied her for a moment, as if trying to understand something deeper. "Why?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. Amina looked down briefly. "Life," she said. It wasn't a full answer, but it was enough. The man gave a small nod, as if he understood more than she had said. "That happens," he replied. There was a short silence between them. Then he reached into his pocket and placed some money on the counter for his tea. But he didn't leave right away. "If you ever decide to play again," he said, "don't wait too long." Amina looked up at him. There was no pressure in his tone, no demand, just a quiet suggestion. He turned and walked toward the door without another word. As he stepped outside, the light from the late afternoon followed him for a moment before the door closed behind him. Amina stood still. His words stayed with her. "Don't wait too long." She repeated them silently in her mind. Rashid approached her again, this time with a different expression. "You've been working here all this time," he said. "And I had no idea." Amina gave a small, uncertain smile. "It never came up." "Well, it should have," he replied. "That piano, I always thought it was useless." He glanced toward the corner where it stood. "Clearly, I was wrong." Amina followed his gaze. The piano looked the same as it always had. Old, quiet, but not forgotten anymore. "Maybe it's not the piano," she said softly. "Maybe it's just been waiting." Rashid let out a small laugh. "Waiting for you, it seems." Amina didn't respond to that. Instead, she placed the tray down and began organizing the counter again. But her movements were slower now, more thoughtful. The rest of the evening passed, but nothing felt quite the same. Customers who had been there earlier stayed longer than usual. Some of them spoke to her briefly, offering kind words about her playing. Others simply smiled when she walked by. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was new, and Amina didn't quite know what to do with it. As the cafe slowly emptied and the night settled in, she returned to her usual closing routine. Wiping tables, stacking chairs, checking everything twice. Rashid locked the door and turned off most of the lights, leaving only a soft glow inside. Amina stood near the counter, her eyes drifting once again toward the piano. It no longer felt distant. It felt close. Real. Rashid noticed her looking. "You can play again before you leave," he said casually. "No one's here now." Amina hesitated. The idea crossed her mind more than once. But this time it felt different. Not like a secret moment. Not like something she had to hide. Still, she shook her head gently. "Maybe another time," she said. Rashid nodded. "All right." He didn't push. Amina picked up her bag and walked toward the door. Before stepping outside, she paused for just a second and looked back again. The piano stood quietly in the corner. But now it felt like a beginning instead of an ending. She stepped out into the night, the cool air brushing against her face. The streets were calm again, just like they had been in the morning. But inside her, something was no longer the same. She walked home slowly, her thoughts moving between the past and the present. The music she had played, the way it felt, the way people had listened, and the words she couldn't forget. Don't wait too long. For the first time in years, Amina allowed herself to wonder what might happen if she didn't. That night, Amina did not fall asleep as easily as she usually did. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the café. The sound of the piano, the silence in the room, the way people had looked at her. It all came back again and again. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was impossible to ignore. She turned to one side, then the other, trying to settle her thoughts. But one sentence stayed with her more than anything else. Don't wait too long. She closed her eyes, but her mind stayed awake. For years, she had pushed music aside. Not because she didn't love it, but because life had made it feel distant, almost impossible to return to. There had always been something more urgent, something more necessary. Work, responsibilities, survival. Music had become something she remembered, not something she lived. But tonight had changed that. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to make her question the path she had accepted. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. The sky was still dark, and the streets were quiet. She sat up slowly, feeling a strange mix of energy and uncertainty. It was as if her body had rested, but her mind was still searching for something. She got ready and stepped outside. The air felt cooler than usual, fresh. As she walked toward the café, her pace was slightly faster than normal. She didn't realize it at first, but there was a quiet anticipation in her steps. When she reached the café, she paused at the door. For a moment, she just stood there. Then she pushed it open. Inside, everything looked the same as always. The tables, the chairs, the counter, and the piano. But something felt different. Or maybe it was just her. She tied her apron and began her routine. Wiping tables, arranging cups, preparing for the day. Her hands moved as they always did, but her attention kept drifting. Again and again, her eyes moved toward the piano. Not out of curiosity this time, but out of awareness. Rashid arrived shortly after. He greeted her with a small nod, then looked around the café before speaking. "Yesterday was something," he said. Amina gave a small smile. "It was unexpected." Rashid leaned against the counter. "You should have told me earlier." Amina shook her head slightly. "I didn't think it mattered." "Well, it does now," he replied. She didn't respond. Not because she disagreed, but because she wasn't sure what that meant yet. The morning started slowly, just like most days. A few regular customers came in, ordered their tea, and took their usual seats. Some of them recognized her from the day before and gave her a different kind of look. It wasn't just polite anymore. It was curious, respectful. One of the older men near the window smiled as she placed his cup down. "You should play again today," he said. Amina hesitated for a second. "Maybe later," she replied. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a refusal either. As the hours passed, more people came in. Word seemed to have spread, even if only a little. A few new faces appeared, people who didn't usually visit the café. Some of them glanced toward the piano before even sitting down. Amina noticed. She felt it. But she didn't let it distract her from her work. At least she tried not to. Around midday, the cafe became busier than usual. The sound of voices filled the room, along with the clinking of cups and plates. It felt almost normal again. Almost. Rashid approached her while she was arranging dishes. "If you want to play again," he said quietly, "you don't have to wait for someone to ask." Amina looked at him. The idea felt strange. For so long, playing had been something she did in private or not at all. The thought of choosing to sit at that piano in front of everyone without being asked, it felt like stepping into something new. "I'll think about it," she said. Rashid nodded. "That's fair." The afternoon moved on. The light coming through the windows shifted, growing warmer as the day slowly leaned toward evening. The cafe began to quiet down again, leaving a more relaxed atmosphere behind. Amina found herself standing near the counter with nothing urgent to do. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to pause. Her eyes moved toward the piano. It was no longer just an object in the corner. It felt like an open door. She took a slow breath. Her hands felt steady. Her thoughts were clear. Without saying anything, she stepped away from the counter. Rashid noticed but didn't stop her. A few customers looked up as she walked across the room. This time, there was no hesitation in her steps. She reached the piano and gently pulled the bench forward. The sound of it sliding against the floor caught people's attention. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Amina sat down. Her hands rested on her lap for a moment. She looked at the keys. Then she placed her fingers on them. This time there was no request, no pressure, just a choice. She began to play. The first notes were soft, but more confident than before. There was no stiffness in her hands now, no uncertainty. The music flowed naturally, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The room responded quickly. Voices faded. Movement slowed. People listened. Amina didn't think about them. She focused on the sound, on the feeling, on the connection she had almost forgotten. The melody grew, not rushed, not forced. It carried a calm strength, something steady and warm. Her fingers moved with ease, shaping the music in a way that felt honest. Each note felt like a step forward, not just in the music, but in her life. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't trying to impress. She was simply allowing herself to be who she had once been, and maybe who she still was. As the music filled the cafe, something changed again. Not as sudden as before, but deeper, more real. People didn't just hear the notes. They felt them. Rashid stood quietly behind the counter, watching with a small smile. The older man by the window closed his eyes, letting the sound carry him. Even those who had never been there before seemed to understand that they were part of something special. Amina continued playing. Her confidence grew with every moment. Her connection to the music strengthened. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was holding anything back. When the final notes came, they didn't feel like an ending. They felt like a beginning. Amina let her hands rest on the keys for a moment before lifting them slowly. The silence that followed was soft, almost gentle. Then came the applause. Stronger this time, warmer, more certain. Amina stood up, her heart steady. She looked around the room, meeting people's eyes without turning away. There was no fear in her expression now, only quiet understanding. She didn't need to hide anymore. As she stepped away from the piano, she felt something settle inside her. Not doubt, not hesitation, but clarity. For the first time in a long time, Amina knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to leave music behind again. The days that followed did not return to how things used to be. At first, Amina thought maybe the moment would fade, like many things do. She believed people would forget, that the cafe would slowly go back to being just another quiet place where she worked without being noticed. But that didn't happen. The very next morning, when she arrived, there were already 2 people waiting outside the cafe. That alone was unusual. They were not regular customers, and they seemed to be talking about something with quiet interest. When Amina opened the door, they stepped in with polite smiles, their eyes quickly moving toward the corner, toward the piano. Amina noticed, but she didn't say anything. She simply nodded and went about her work as she always did. Still, she could feel a small shift in the air. It was no longer just a place people came to eat and leave. Something had changed. Rashid arrived soon after and paused when he saw the early customers. "This is new," he said under his breath. Amina gave a small smile. It seems so. As the morning moved on, more people came in than usual. Some of them ordered tea and food, but many of them kept glancing toward the piano, as if waiting for something. Amina stayed focused on her work, but she understood what they were hoping for. By midday, the café was more crowded than it had been in a long time. Conversations filled the space, but there was a sense of anticipation beneath it all. Rashid leaned closer to her while she was placing cups on a tray. "You see what's happening?" he said quietly. Amina nodded. "They're here for you." She hesitated for a moment. "Maybe for the music." Rashid smiled slightly. "Same thing if you ask me." She didn't argue. Instead, she carried the tray to one of the tables and continued her work. But her thoughts were not as steady as her hands. She could feel the expectation growing around her. Not in a heavy or uncomfortable way, but in a quiet, patient way. No one demanded anything. No one asked directly, but they waited. The afternoon light stretched across the floor, and the café reached a calm point between busy and quiet. It was that familiar moment when everything slowed down just enough to breathe. Amina stood near the counter, her hands resting lightly on its surface. She looked toward the piano. It no longer felt like something separate from her life. Felt like a part of it again. Rashid noticed her glance and gave a small nod, as if to say he understood. Amina took a breath. Then she stepped forward. The room seemed to notice without her saying a word. Conversation softened, and a few heads turned as she walked across the floor. This time, there was no surprise in their faces. Only quiet expectation. She reached the piano and sat down. Her movements were calm, steady, familiar. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers rested on the keys, and for a brief moment, she closed her eyes. Not to escape, but to focus. When she began to play, the sound filled the café with a gentle strength. It was not just about skill anymore. It was about connection. Each note felt clear, honest, and full of meaning. The room responded instantly. Silence settled again, but it wasn't empty. It was shared. Amina played with confidence now. There was no trace of the uncertainty she had felt before. Her hands moved freely, shaping the music in a way that felt natural and true. This was no longer a hidden part of her. It was something she was allowing others to see. As the melody grew, it carried a sense of warmth that spread through the room. People listened without distraction. Some leaned forward slightly. Others sat back, letting the sound reach them in their own way. Rashid stood quietly behind the counter, watching with a look of quiet pride. The café, once just a place of routine, had become something more, and Amina was at the center of it. She continued playing, letting the music flow without forcing it. There was a calm rhythm to it, something steady that made people feel at ease. Time seemed to slow down. No one checked the clock. No one rushed to leave. For those few moments, nothing else mattered. When the final notes came, they were soft and gentle, like a quiet goodbye that promised to return again. Amina let her hands rest for a second before lifting them. The silence that followed was peaceful. Then came the applause. It wasn't loud or overwhelming. It was warm, grateful, real. Amina stood up slowly and turned toward the room. This time, she didn't feel nervous. She didn't look away. She met their eyes with a calm expression, acknowledging their presence without needing to say anything. That was enough. As she stepped away from the piano, one of the customers spoke up. "You should play every day." Amina paused and smiled softly. "Maybe not every day," she said, "but I won't stop." The answer felt right. It wasn't a promise she couldn't keep. It was something honest. The rest of the day moved forward, but the feeling stayed. People continued to talk about the music, not in loud or excited ways, but in thoughtful, quiet conversations. By the time evening arrived, the café had slowly emptied again. Amina finished her work as usual, wiping tables and preparing to close. But everything felt different now, even the simple tasks. Rashid locked the door and turned to her. "You've changed this place," he said. Amina shook her head gently. "Maybe it just needed a reason." Rashid smiled. "And you were that reason." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked toward the piano one more time. It was still the same old instrument, but it no longer felt forgotten. Neither did she. Amina picked up her bag and walked toward the door. As she stepped outside, the evening air greeted her with a soft breeze. The street looked the same. The buildings, the quiet, the fading light. But something inside her had shifted in a way she could not ignore. She was no longer just someone who served tea and cleared tables. She was someone who carried music again. And this time, she wasn't going to hide it. As she walked home, her steps felt lighter. Not because her life had suddenly become easy, but because she had found something she thought she had lost. Something that belonged to her. The past was no longer a weight. It was a part of her story. And the future no longer felt uncertain. Felt open. For the first time in a long while, Amina allowed herself to look ahead without fear. Not to a perfect life. Not to something impossible. But to something real. A life where she could work, live, and still hold on to the part of her that made her feel alive. The music hadn't saved her. It hadn't solved everything. But it had reminded her of who she was. And sometimes that is enough to begin again.